Is auto mode truly automatic? How do different metering modes affect exposure? What settings must be dialed in manually in auto mode? And what's the purpose of the exposure compensation dial? If you're struggling with auto modes, got a few minutes to spare, then stick around and find out if it is all palaver. In early February, I released a video on my use of manual mode in street photography. Some of you are here because of it. If you haven't watched it yet, press pause, go watch it, and pretend like the rest of us are all here waiting for you. Following the video, several of you shared with me well thought out comments regarding some of the flaws in my experiment. You pointed out my lack of attention to the camera's metering mode and failure to use the exposure compensation dial. You were, of course, correct. I will attempt to clarify some of the unresolved issues from my previous experiment. And while doing that, I'll share with you some of my favorite photos from February. But first, let me go off on a tangent. If you're impatient, you can always skip ahead to the next chapter explaining the different metering modes down below. I got into photography in late 2015 with the Panasonic GH4. Due to my work schedule, I rarely had time to shoot and pay attention to camera settings. When I did end up using my camera, usually on vacation, the results were terrible and disappointing. I sucked, I knew it, and I wanted to get better. So I did what many people do. I bought a bunch of unnecessary gear. In my mind, the reason my photos sucked was not my deficiency of skill, but the limitations of my equipment. After buying almost anything and everything YouTubers were pushing on me at the time, and seeing the limited progress, I realized that the problem lay elsewhere. So I did what many people do. I looked for tips and tricks. I looked for shortcuts. YouTube's algorithms, after months of feeding me gear content, quickly adapted to my change of appetite and started feeding me the new junk food I wanted to consume. Videos that teach me how to shoot like a pro, that show me what the pros don't want you to know. Tips to instantly up your photography game. You get the drift. Here is an example from a video YouTube fed me just a few days ago from a very prominent photography channel. Shooting manual is a valuable tool for seasoned photographers. It's often used as a scam by gatekeepers to keep photography hard. I get DMs from people all the time that have gone on photography courses with impressive National Geographic photographers who've honestly bored them to death and confused them yapping on about the exposure triangle. Now, I'm no National Geographic photographer, not even close, but it turns out, to my dismay, that there is a global conspiracy to keep photography hard. The video then goes on to explain how to shoot in auto mode for a full 10 minutes. But, like my previous video, ignores metering modes and exposure compensation altogether. These were the kind of videos I consumed when starting out. Being naive, I tried all the shortcuts I was pushed. But at the end, they were all just bite-sized chunks of unrelated and incoherent information. As a result, I never truly understood the exposure triangle or the different metering modes. Now let's get everyone in sync and rush through the three main metering modes. Matrix metering. The camera meters a wide area of the frame and sets exposure according to tone distribution, color composition, and distance. Center weighted metering. The camera assigns the greatest weight to the center of the frame. The size of the area assigned can sometimes be adjusted using custom settings. Spot metering. The camera meters a circle measuring 1.5% of the frame, at least on the Nikon ZF. This can be used when the subject background is much brighter or darker. I, of course, knew none of this. The junk food content I consumed did not mention any of this. After a year of failures, I realized my chosen method of learning was getting me nowhere. I decided to do what should have been obvious to me from the start: go back to the fundamentals. In early 2017, I purchased a book called Understanding Exposure by Brian Peterson. It truly changed the way I approach photography. I'll leave a link in the show notes if anyone is interested. The book is not revolutionary by any means. It simply clearly explains the fundamentals of light, aperture, and shutter speed, and how they interact with and influence one another. We tend to complicate things when starting out. We need to keep it simple, and this book, in my opinion, does just that. Let's get back to setting up the camera properly for shooting in auto mode. After setting up the metering mode for the environment I'm shooting in, there are a few more steps to be taken for the camera to expose quote-unquote correctly in auto mode. To make sure the camera keeps the exposure within reasonable parameters, I need to define the max ISO. A short search on YouTube will show that it must be set to exactly 4000, or 6400, or 12800, depending on the expert providing the advice. To minimize camera shake, I will need to set a minimum shutter speed, which is exactly 1/160, according to the video I mentioned earlier. The camera can't set it to 1/160, no matter, because it is actually 1/125 seconds according to another video. So, once I set up the max ISO, the minimum shutter speed, select the metering mode, I can then switch to aperture priority mode, set the desired aperture, and the camera will calculate the correct exposure settings automatically. Using auto modes seemed unnecessarily cumbersome to me, especially since I still needed to understand exposure to use these modes properly. So I ditched automatic mode completely and went full autocratic. Like a true dictator, I decided to control every little detail of the photographic process, even at the risk of complete disaster. My usual process starts with choosing the aperture, and then, instead of choosing the max ISO, I choose the actual ISO. Instead of choosing the minimum shutter speed, I choose the actual shutter speed. The metering mode does not affect manual exposure, so one less setting to worry about. Going back to basics was not easy. Getting used to manual exposure took some time and effort. Okay, I'm being a manual mode snob again, and it is probably annoying some of you. There's nothing wrong with shooting in auto mode. Nobody cares if a good photo was shot in manual, shutter priority, or program mode. What about the exposure compensation dial, you ask? Great question. A quick recap. In aperture priority, for example, the camera calculates the correct exposure based on the metering mode, the max ISO, the minimum shutter speed, and the preferred aperture. The method of calculating exposure is different from camera to camera, and the algorithms confidential. However, camera manufacturers are so confident in their method that they provide an additional manual dial on the camera, the exposure compensation dial. The exposure compensation dial is a classic complication of automation. Its sole purpose is to correct automated settings. The dial lets the camera know that although manually fed the desired aperture, max ISO, and minimum shutter speed, the metering was still incorrect, and the exposure wrong. It then tells the camera to recalculate the exposure using the exact same method, but now with an additional manual setting, up to 3 stops brighter or darker. Instead of switching the camera to auto mode, manually tweaking up to 5 different settings, and then still getting the exposure wrong, by just manually adjusting 3 settings, I can get the exposure wrong all by myself. Once I understood the exposure triangle, it was all about putting in the hours and slowly gaining experience. I can now finally document my life at a level that satisfies me. I can look back at my photographs, see the improvements I've made over the years, and know that my photography sucks less than before. What do you know? Turns out those experienced National Geographic photographers, those so-called gatekeepers, do know what they're talking about. Switching to the Nikon ZF with its retro dials has boosted the efficiency and intuitiveness of my street photography. I usually have my shutter speed set at 1/250 and the ISO at 100 by default. I then select the appropriate aperture for the scene, usually around f8 during the day and f4 at night. then I just need to adjust a single dial for most of the shoot, the ISO. If there are significant changes in light, or if the ISO required ends up being too high, I adjust the aperture and start again. This is an efficient workflow for me, using the camera I have, the environment I shoot in, and the style of photos I like to take. I find this method of shooting simple, fast, and elegant. The use of automation in any workflow is all about speed, efficiency, and success rates. Choose what you automate and understand the trade-offs. Many of the auto mode settings are found deep in the menus. If you can navigate your camera's menus with ease, this is no issue. If you're already familiar with your camera and can anticipate how to meters, fantastic. I'm no gatekeeper and no manual mode fanatic, just a snob. You disagree? You think I'm full of it? Feel free to tear me a new one in the comments. Constructive or destructive feedback is always welcome on this channel. Street photography has all the elements you need to make an interesting photo. It is also incredibly challenging. Sometimes you have close to zero control of what is happening in real time. In a flash of a second, you need to master composition, shadows and light, colors, reflections, layers, and moving subjects. If you're well prepared and a little lucky, that beautiful light does not vanish. That person does not move. You choose the mode that works best for you, and you get to capture a precious flash of time. The thrill of the hunt with a camera. Thanks if you made it so far. Enjoy the hunt, and see you next week.